The bacon sizzled in the cast-iron skillet, fat popping and hissing as golden light poured through the kitchen window. Thomas Garrett stood at the stove spatula in one weathered hand, coffee in the other, watching grease pool and shimmer like liquid amber. The smell filled every corner of the small ranch house, thick and rich and unmistakably American. Salt, smoke, home. But the woman in his barn wouldn't touch it. For 3 days now she had refused every meal, every offering, every attempt at basic human decency. She sat on that hay bale like a statue carved from stone, and stubbornness, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on nothing, waiting for something Thomas couldn't name. Waiting, he suspected, to die. He cracked 4 eggs into the pan beside the bacon, watching the whites bloom and bubble. Outside, the Texas sun was already climbing, turning the dirt roads to dust and the sky to brass. October in West Texas meant heat that came early and stayed late, the kind that baked the sense out of a man if he let it. But heat didn't seem to bother her. She sat in that barn without shade, without water, without mercy for herself. Thomas flipped the bacon. 6 strips. 2 for him, 4 for her if she'd take them. He'd learned long ago that hunger was a patient enemy. It waited. It wore you down. And eventually it won. He plated the food with the kind of care his wife used to mock him for. 2 eggs, 3 strips of bacon, 1 biscuit split open with butter melting into its center. Margaret always said he plated breakfast like he was serving the president. He'd tell her the president probably didn't appreciate good food half as much as she did. She'd laugh, kiss his cheek, steal a piece of his bacon when she thought he wasn't looking. Margaret had been gone 9 months now. Thomas picked up the tray and walked out into the morning, boots crunching on gravel. The barn sat 100 yards from the house, old wood silvered by decades of sun and wind. He could see her through the gap in the door. Same position as yesterday, same position as the day before. The Japanese woman who wouldn't eat. Her name was Akiko. The army had told him that much when they dropped her off with a clipboard and a handshake and instructions to keep her fed and accounted for until transport came through in 8 weeks. POW labor assignment, they called it. Routine processing. She'd work the ranch, help with chores, earn her keep until they shipped her to the California camps for repatriation. Only she wouldn't work, wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak except to say no. Thomas pushed the barn door open with his boot. Morning light spilled across hay-strewn floor, dust motes dancing in the shaft of sun. She sat exactly where he'd left her 2 hours ago. Her uniform hung on her like cloth on a scarecrow, Japanese military issue, faded to the color of old bruises. The shoulder seam had torn, he noticed. The cuff on her left sleeve was fraying badly. He set the tray down 6 feet from where she sat. Close enough to smell. Far enough to give her space. She didn't look at it. Thomas stood there, hat in hand, waiting. Her eyes tracked to the plate, lingered on the bacon for half a second, then cut away like she'd been slapped. Her throat worked. A swallow. Her hands tightened in her lap, knuckles going white. But she didn't move. He'd seen this before. Saipan, 1944. Japanese families at the cliff edge, mothers holding children, choosing death over surrender because someone had convinced them the Americans were monsters. Thomas had been a medic then, close enough to the front to see what war did to bodies, but not close enough to stop what it did to minds. He'd watched a woman cut her own children's throats rather than let him help them. He'd saved one, a 4-year-old boy. The child had bitten his hand hard enough to draw blood, spit in his face, screamed words Thomas couldn't understand but felt in his bones. Hate, pure and absolute. This woman had that same look. Not hate exactly, something colder. Resignation. Thomas cleared his throat. "You gonna eat today?" Her eyes flicked to him, then away. No answer. He waited another 10 seconds, then picked up the tray and walked back to the house. Behind him, he heard nothing. No movement. No sound. Just silence, heavy and thick as the heat. At the porch, he stopped and dumped the plate into the dog bowl. His 2 cattle dogs, Bess and Duke, fell on it like wolves. They were done in 30 seconds, licking the ceramic clean. Through the barn's open door, Thomas saw her watching. Just for a moment. Her face was blank, but her hands had moved to her stomach, pressing there like she could hold the hunger in by force. He went back inside and poured himself another cup of coffee. Black, hot enough to burn, hot enough to... He drank it standing at the window watching the barn. Margaret used to tell him he had a savior complex, always picking up strays, dogs, injured horses, baby birds fallen from nests. Once a rattlesnake with a broken spine that he'd tried to splint before it bit him, and he had to shoot it. "You can't save everything, Tom," she'd said. "Some things don't want saving." But Margaret had saved people who didn't want it too. She'd been a Navy nurse at Pearl Harbor, worked herself to exhaustion in the aftermath. She hadn't died in the attack. She'd died 3 years later in January of 1945 from an infection her exhausted immune system couldn't fight, trying to deliver their first child in a hospital, still overwhelmed with wounded. The baby Sarah had lived. Margaret hadn't. Thomas finished his coffee and set the cup down harder than he meant to. The sound cracked through the kitchen like a gunshot. He walked to the cabinet above the refrigerator and pulled down a thermos. Filled it with coffee, added cream and sugar the way Margaret used to take hers, screwed the lid on tight, walked back out to the barn. This time when he entered, the woman looked up. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp enough to cut. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes had the glassy sheen of someone 3 days without water in 100-degree heat. Thomas set the thermos down and stepped back. "This ain't food," he said. "Just coffee. Even enemies deserve coffee." He turned and walked out before she could refuse. From the house he watched. She stared at the thermos for 20 minutes, didn't touch it, didn't move. The sun climbed higher, turning the barn into an oven. Sweat darkened her uniform. Still she sat. Thomas made himself lunch. Ham sandwich, apple, more coffee. He ate without tasting it, eyes on the barn. At 2 in the afternoon she reached for the thermos. Her hand shook so badly she nearly knocked it over. She steadied it with both hands, unscrewed the cap with fingers that trembled like leaves in wind, lifted it to her nose and inhaled. Her eyes closed. Something in her face cracked just for a second. A fracture in stone. She drank. Not a sip. A gulp. Then another. She drank half the thermos before she stopped, gasping coffee running down her chin. She wiped it away with the back of her hand and stared at the wet streak on her skin like she didn't recognize it. Then she cried, silent tears streaming down her face, shoulders shaking. She set the thermos down very carefully as if it might explode and buried her face in her hands. Her whole body curled inward, folding around the pain. Thomas looked away. Grief was private. He knew that much. An hour later, he took her dinner. Same routine. Bacon, eggs, biscuit. Set it down. Walked away. This time he added a glass of water, condensation beading on the outside. From the window, he watched her stare at the plate for 10 minutes. 15. 20. Then she picked up the bacon, held it between thumb and forefinger like something fragile, brought it close to her face and breathed in. Her eyes closed again. Her expression was strange. Not hungry, not grateful. Something else entirely. Confused. She bit into it. The reaction was immediate. Her eyes flew open wide and shocked. She chewed slowly, mechanically, like her jaw had forgotten how to work. Swallowed, stared at the remaining bacon in her hand. Then she ate the rest in 3 bites. The eggs followed, then the biscuit, butter and all. She ate like someone drowning, fast and desperate and barely breathing. When the plate was empty, she set it down and doubled over, arms wrapped around her middle forehead, nearly touching her knees. Thomas couldn't tell if she was crying or being sick. He waited until full dark before he went to collect the plate. She was curled on her side in the hay knees, drawn up, one hand still pressed to her stomach. Asleep or unconscious, he couldn't tell. The plate sat clean beside her, licked so thoroughly it looked washed. Thomas picked it up quietly and walked back to the house. He washed it in the sink, hands moving through motions worn smooth by 48 years of living. The kitchen was too quiet without Margaret humming while she dried. Too empty without her hip bumping his while she put dishes away. He dried the plate and put it in the cabinet, poured himself a whiskey, drank it looking out the window at the barn. In the Pacific they'd told him the Japanese would never surrender, would fight to the last man, woman, child, would choose death over dishonor every single time. And he'd seen it. Families walking into the ocean, soldiers charging machine guns with empty rifles, nurses killing the wounded rather than let them be captured. The propaganda had said Americans were devils, monsters. That capture meant torture and violation and erasure of everything you were. But Thomas had also seen the ones who did surrender, the shock in their eyes when they got food, clean water, medical care, the confusion when they weren't beaten or killed, the slow, painful realization that everything they'd been told was a lie. That woman in his barn had spent 3 days choosing death. Then she'd tasted bacon and something had broken. Or maybe something had mended. Thomas wasn't sure which. He finished his whiskey and went to bed. The next morning he made breakfast at dawn. Same routine. Bacon, eggs, biscuit, coffee. He carried it to the barn, expecting to find her in the same spot, still curled up, still sleeping off 3 days of starvation. Instead, she was standing. Not just standing. She'd moved. The hay bale where she'd sat for 3 days was pushed to the side. She'd swept the immediate area with her hands. He could see the marks in the dust. She stood near the door, back straight, hands clasped in front of her. When he entered, she bowed. A deep bow, formal and precise. Thomas stopped, set the tray down, took his hat off because it seemed rude not to. She straightened and met his eyes. Hers were red-rimmed but clear, awake. Why, she said. Her English was rough, heavily accented. Why you feed enemy? Thomas considered the question. The real answer was complicated. Involved Margaret and dead children on Saipan, and a promise he'd made at a grave to be better than his hate. But he didn't have words for all that, not words that would translate, so he said the simple truth. Because you were hungry. She stared at him like he'd spoken in tongues. Her brow furrowed, confusion deepening. In Japan, she said slowly, we are told American hate us. Want revenge for war. Thomas nodded. Yeah, we were told you'd never surrender, that you'd rather die than accept help. He gestured to the plate. Looks like we were both told a lot of things. She looked at the food, back at him. Something flickered across her face. Not trust. Not yet. But the beginning of a question. The first crack in a wall she'd built brick by brick out of propaganda and fear. She knelt beside the plate and ate slowly this time. Deliberately. Between bites she glanced up at him like she expected him to snatch it away, or poison it, or demand something in return. Thomas just stood there, hat in hand, watching a stranger learn that kindness could exist without conditions. When she finished, she set the plate down and spoke without looking up. My name is Akiko. Thomas nodded. I know. Army told me. No, she said. You know name on paper. I tell you now. Myself. Akiko Hayashi. She looked up, and for the first time her eyes held something besides resignation. Thomas, he said. Thomas Garrett. She repeated it carefully. Tumas. Then she bowed again. He offered his hand instead. We shake hands here, he said. She stared at his hand like it might bite her. Then slowly she reached out. Her hand was small and cold and shook in his grip. He shook once firm but gentle and let go. She pulled her hand back and looked at it. At him. At the empty plate. Why you give me food when I say no? She asked. Because no don't mean you ain't hungry, Thomas said. Just means you're scared of what yes might cost. He picked up the plate and walked to the door. Stopped. Turned back. You can come up to the house if you want. Got running water. A bathroom. Real bed in the spare room. She shook her head quickly. Here is good. Suit yourself. But door's open if you change your mind. He left her there and walked back across the yard. The sun was fully up now, heat already building. By noon it would be brutal. By evening, suffocating. But the woman in his barn had drunk coffee and eaten bacon and spoken her own name. It was a start. 3 days of silence broken by 6 strips of bacon and a thermos of coffee. Margaret would have laughed at that. Would have said Thomas always did have a gift for feeding things that bit. Would have kissed him and called him a fool and loved him for it anyway. Thomas went inside and started making lunch. Fried chicken this time. Margaret's recipe. The one she'd made the day he proposed, sitting on this same porch, sweet tea, sweating in mason jars. If bacon could break a hunger strike, he wondered what fried chicken might do. Outside, through the window, he saw Akiko emerge from the barn. She stood in the doorway, one hand shading her eyes, looking at the house. At him. She didn't come closer. But she didn't go back inside either. She just stood there, a woman caught between what she'd been taught and what she'd tasted, trying to figure out which truth to believe. Thomas figured that was about the bravest thing a person could do. He kept cooking. The fried chicken sat golden and glistening on the plate skin, crackling with rendered fat steam rising in lazy spirals that carried the smell of pepper and salt and something close to salvation. Thomas had made it exactly the way Margaret taught him, back when they were young and broke, and chicken was a Sunday luxury. Buttermilk brine overnight, double dredge in flour and spices, cast iron hot enough to spit. He carried it to the barn at noon, the Texas heat pressing down like a hand on his shoulders. Akiko was where he'd left her that morning, sitting just inside the doorway where a slant of shade offered mercy from the sun. She'd swept more of the barn floor, he noticed, arranged the hay bales into something resembling furniture, created order from chaos because that was what you did when everything else was broken. She looked up when his shadow fell across her workspace. Her eyes went to the plate, widened. Thomas set it down along with a mason jar of sweet tea, ice cubes clinking. "What is this?" she asked. "Fried chicken." Thomas gestured at it. "Margaret's recipe. My wife. She made it better than I do, but this'll have to do." Akiko's gaze lingered on the chicken, then jumped to his face. "Your wife cook for you, used to." Thomas felt the familiar ache, dull now after 9 months, but still there. "She died while I was overseas. Complications from childbirth." The words came easier now. He'd said them enough times that they'd worn smooth, lost their sharpest edges. Didn't mean they hurt less, just meant he knew how to carry the hurt. Akiko's expression shifted. Something softened. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "Very sorry." "Yeah." Thomas cleared his throat. "Well, food's there if you want it. Tea, too. Gets hot in here." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Thomas-san." He looked back. She was standing now, formal posture, hands clasped. "In Japan, men not cook," she said. "Women cook. Always women. In America," Thomas said, "whoever's hungry cooks. Or you starve." The corner of her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. She sat back down and reached for the chicken with both hands, lifted it carefully like something precious. Brought it to her face and breathed in. Her eyes closed. Thomas watched her inhale the smell of his dead wife's recipe, watched memories move across her face like clouds. She bit into the chicken leg, and her whole body went still, chewed slowly, swallowed, opened her eyes and stared at the chicken like it had personally betrayed her. "This is," she started, then stopped, searched for words. "Better than rice I eat in war." The admission seemed to cost her something. Her shoulders curled inward, shame written in the curve of her spine. "War don't make good food," Thomas said. "Makes you grateful for anything that ain't rotten." She nodded and kept eating. Thomas left her to it. Inside the house, he cleaned up the kitchen and tried not to think about how Margaret used to hum while she fried chicken, how she'd sneak him pieces straight from the pan, even though they were hot enough to burn, how she'd laughed when he proposed with a chicken leg in one hand and a ring in the other, grease on both their faces, sitting on this porch, watching the sun go down. The sound of footsteps on gravel pulled him from the memory. Akiko stood at the bottom of the porch steps, empty plate in hand, looking uncertain. Thomas pushed the screen door open. "You can just leave it there," he said. She climbed the steps instead, slow and careful, and held the plate out to him with both hands. Another bow. "Thank you for meal." "Welcome." Thomas took the plate. Their fingers didn't touch, but he saw hers were shaking slightly. "You feeling all right?" She nodded, then shook her head, then seemed unsure which answer was true. "I feel," she said, confused. "About what?" She gestured vaguely, taking in the house, the ranch, him. "All of this. In Japan, they tell us Americans are devils, monsters. If we are captured, they will hurt us, violate us. We must die before surrender. But you surrendered. Emperor, tell us surrender, so I surrender. But I think," she paused, "I think I will die anyway, slowly, with pain." Thomas leaned against the porch railing. "And instead you give me coffee, bacon, chicken." She looked down at her hands. "No pain, no violation, just food. Good food." Her voice cracked on the last word. "They lied to you," Thomas said gently. "Both sides lied. We were told you'd fight to the last breath, that you were fanatics who'd never quit. But here you are." "Here I am," she echoed. "But I do not know what I am now. If Emperor wrong, if America not devil, then what is truth? Who am I?" The question hung in the hot air between them. "I don't know," Thomas said, "but I figure we got 8 weeks to sort it out." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. 8 weeks. That afternoon, Thomas found her trying to mend her uniform with thread pulled from the hem. She sat in the barn doorway, squinting in the light, fingers fumbling with a needle too bent to thread properly. She'd been at it for over an hour, he guessed, based on the pile of broken thread at her feet. He watched for a minute, remembering Margaret doing the same thing, same concentration, same precise movements. Then he went inside and climbed the stairs to the bedroom he hadn't entered in 9 months. Margaret's sewing kit sat on her dresser exactly where she'd left it. Dust covered the walnut box, but the brass latch still shone. Thomas's hands shook as he opened it. The smell hit him first. Lavender sachets she'd tucked between the thread spools. Her smell. Her hands had touched every item in this box. He closed his eyes and let himself hurt for 30 seconds. Then he picked up the box and carried it downstairs. Akiko looked up when his shadow fell across her. Her eyes went to the box, then his face reading something there that made her own expression gentle. "My wife's," Thomas said. He set it beside her. "She'd want it used." Akiko opened the lid slowly, reverently. Her breath caught. "So many colors," she whispered. "So many needles." She picked up the silver thimble, turned it in the light. Saw the engraving. "To Monsieur Love makes us braver. T. 1940. Your wife name was M. Margaret." Thomas sat down on the porch step, suddenly tired. "We got married in 40. I gave her that thimble for our first anniversary. She was lucky woman. I was the lucky one." Akiko set the thimble down carefully and selected a needle black thread. She threaded it on the first try, hands steady now with proper tools. "You loved her very much, more than sense." She began to stitch her sleeve movements, practiced and sure. "In Japan, I also love someone, my brother, Takeshi." The past tense landed heavy. "He died at Okinawa," she continued, needle moving in and out. "Before that, my mother died. Shame of surrender, they say. But I think she died because she cannot bear more loss." Thomas thought of the cliff at Saipan, the mother and children. "I'm sorry. War take everything from both of us," Akiko said quietly. "But war is over now." "Yeah. So why loss still here?" Thomas didn't have an answer for that. They sat in silence, him on the porch, her on the ground, both working through grief with their hands. Him cleaning tack he didn't need to clean. Her mending uniform she'd probably never wear again. After a while she spoke again. "Thomas-san, why you keep her sewing kit if it hurt to see, because throwing it away would hurt more." Thomas set down the bridle he'd been oiling. "Keeping it means she's still part of the house, still matters." Akiko nodded slowly. "I understand. I keep my brother button from his uniform. Only thing I have left. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass button worn smooth by constant touching. Showed it to him. I sew this on his uniform before he leave for war. He tell me uniform with sisters sewing is stronger. Make him brave. Did it know? She closed her fist around the button. He die anyway. But maybe he die brave. I hope so. They sat with that for a while. Two people who'd lost everything to the same war, finding something like understanding in a dusty barnyard in Texas. The next afternoon, while Akiko was mending a tear in the barn wall, she found a photograph wedged between two boards. Dust-covered sun faded, but still clear enough to see. A woman in a Navy nurse uniform standing in front of a white building marked Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital. On the back, in faded ink, Margaret Garrett, December 1944. Akiko stared at the photograph for a long time. This was Thomas's wife, the woman whose sewing kit she now used, the woman who had died saving enemy children. She carried the photo to the house that evening and handed it to Thomas without a word. Thomas took it with shaking hands. "Where'd you find this in barn?" "Between wood." Akiko's English faltered. "I think wind carry it there. Long time ago." Thomas traced Margaret's face with one finger. "Yeah, probably." He cleared his throat. "She was pregnant here. Didn't know it yet." 2 weeks later, Pearl Harbor happened. She saved children, Japanese children, at Pearl Harbor, 3 of them. Submarine crew families, officers' kids. Thomas's voice went rough. She didn't see enemies, just scared kids who needed a nurse. Akiko's eyes filled. And she'd die because of this. She died because she cared more about saving lives than saving herself. Thomas looked up. Kind of like someone else I know. Someone who'd rather starve than ask for help. Their eyes met. Understanding passed between them, wordless and complete. "I am not brave like your wife," Akiko whispered. "No." Thomas handed the photo back. "You're brave in a different way. She saved people who wanted saving. You're learning to save yourself. That's harder." Akiko held the photograph carefully as if it might crumble. "Can I keep this? To remember?" Thomas nodded. She'd like that. Thomas stood. "You hungry?" "Always." "Now," she said, almost smiling. "Before I choose not eat. Now I cannot stop eating." "Good. Means you're healing." He made dinner that night with Akiko watching from the barn doorway. Pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans from the garden. Simple food, working food, the kind that stuck to your ribs and made you remember you were alive. He set her plate on the porch step and his own beside it. She hesitated, then climbed the steps and sat. They ate in silence, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, turning the sky orange and pink and purple. "What is that sound?" Akiko asked suddenly. "Cattle." Thomas pointed toward the pasture where his small herd was settling for the night. "Got about 30 head. Not much, but it's a living. In Japan I never see cow, only picture." "You serious?" She nodded. "In city we have fish, rice, no cow, no big animal like this." Thomas thought about that. A whole life without cows or wide open spaces or the smell of grass after rain. He couldn't imagine it. "You want to see them up close?" Her eyes lit up. "I can." "Come on." He led her across the yard to the fence. The cattle had already bedded down for the night, dark shapes against darker grass. A few lifted their heads at the approaching human's eyes reflecting moonlight. Thomas whistled low. His favorite, a red heifer named Rosie, lumbered over. She was 15 years old, gentle as a dog, had probably forgotten she was ever wild. Akiko pressed against the fence, half curious, half terrified. "So big. Hold your hand out flat. Let her smell you." Akiko extended her hand slowly. Rosie's nose was velvet soft breath, hot and grassy. She snuffled Akiko's palm, looking for treats, then huffed in disappointment when she found none. Akiko laughed. Actually laughed. The sound was rusty, like something that hadn't been used in years, but it was real. "She is gentle," Akiko said, wonder in her voice. Rosie's a sweetheart. Thomas scratched behind the cow's ears. Been with me since she was a calf. Margaret named her. Margaret loved animals, loved everything. Thomas's throat tightened. People, animals, broken things. She had this way of seeing the good in stuff before she saw the bad. Akiko was quiet for a moment. Then softly, I think you are like her. See good first. I don't know about that. You feed enemy, she pointed out. That is seeing good. Or stupidity. No. She turned to face him serious now. Is bravery. Harder than fighting, easier to hate than to feed. Thomas didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, and they stood there watching the cattle settle and the stars come out. Two broken people learning that maybe broken didn't mean finished. 3 days later, Thomas found Akiko staring at the horses in the far pasture. She stood at the fence rail, hands gripping the weathered wood, watching them move through morning mist like ghosts made solid. You ever ridden? Thomas asked from behind her. She startled, turned. In Japan, no. Only samurai. Rich people. Not for me. In America, anybody can ride if they want to learn. He gestured toward the barn. Come on. The mare he brought out was Rosie, same red heifer who'd snuffled Akiko's palm days before, but this time saddled, bridled, patient as stone. Akiko's eyes went wide. Too big, she whispered. She's gentle as a church mouse. Thomas patted Rosie's neck. Margaret named her. Said she was sweet as a rose with thorns nobody ever saw. Your wife rode every Sunday. Said it cleared her head after a week of blood and screaming. Thomas's voice went quiet. Last time she rode, she was 4 months pregnant. Didn't know it yet. Akiko touched Rosie's shoulder, tentative as prayer. The horse's warmth spread through her palm. Alive, solid, real. Thomas showed her how to mount. Left foot in stirrup swing, right leg over settle into the saddle. It took 3 tries. Akiko kept freezing halfway up, certain she'd fall, certain the horse would bolt. But Rosie stood like she'd been carved from patience itself. When Akiko finally settled into the saddle, something shifted in her face. She sat 8 feet off the ground, hands white-knuckled on the horn, breathing like she'd run a mile. But her eyes held wonder. Thomas led Rosie by the halter-slow walk around the corral. Akiko swayed with the rhythm, terrified and transfixed. After 2 loops, Thomas asked, You want to try without me holding on? She nodded, unable to speak. He released the halter. Just squeeze your legs gentle. She'll walk. Akiko squeezed. Rosie walked. And for the first time since the Emperor's voice had crackled over the radio telling her the war was lost, Akiko felt something other than grief. She felt free. The laugh came without warning, bubbling up from somewhere she'd thought had died at sea. Thomas watched this woman who'd chosen starvation 3 weeks ago now laughing on his dead wife's horse, and something in his chest loosened. After 20 minutes, Akiko dismounted, legs shaking. She bowed to Rosie first, then to Thomas. Thank you, she said. I forget what it feels like. To choose. Thomas walked to the barn and returned with something in his hands. His hat. Battered, sun-faded, sweat-stained from 40 years of Texas summers. He set it on her head. Too big. It slipped down over her eyebrows. She pushed it back, confused. You earned it, Thomas said. Official Texas cowboy now. Akiko lifted the hat off, turned it in her hands like something sacred. But I am enemy. Japanese. No. Thomas met her eyes. You're Akiko, the woman who rides Rosie and laughs doing it. Her eyes filled. She clutched the hat to her chest. I can keep long as you want. That night, Akiko slept with the cowboy hat beside her in the hay. She ran her fingers along the brim in the dark, tracing the shape of a choice she'd been given without having to beg for it. The next morning, Thomas found her wearing it while she swept the barn. It still slipped over her eyes. She didn't care. The next morning, Helen arrived. Thomas's mother-in-law pulled up in her ancient Ford truck, dust-billowing baby Sarah wailing in the passenger seat. She climbed out, looking like thunder, all 5 feet 2 inches of her, vibrating with righteous fury. Thomas Garrett, she called across the yard. I heard in town you got a Japanese POW living in your barn. News travels fast, Thomas said mildly. Helen marched toward him, Sarah on her hip. The baby was red-faced and screaming, fists waving. "Is it true Army assigned her?" "Temporary work detail. Work detail." Helen's voice could have stripped paint. "Tom, my daughter died because of them. Because of what they started at Pearl Harbor." "Margaret died in childbirth," Thomas said quietly. "Not from a bullet. From exhaustion. From overwork. From a system overwhelmed by casualties." She pointed at the barn where Akiko had appeared in the doorway, frozen. "That woman's people killed my daughter." Akiko's face went white. She bowed deeply, formal and terrible. "I am sorry," she said. "Very sorry for your loss." Helen's anger faltered. She stared at this small woman bowing like her spine might break, and something in her expression cracked. "How old are you?" 24, Akiko said, still bowed. "Same as Margaret." Helen's voice went rough. "Same age as my baby." Sarah chose that moment to reach toward Akiko, tiny hands grasping at air. The baby made a questioning sound, stopped crying, fascinated by this new person. Helen pulled Sarah back. "Don't you dare!" But Sarah was having none of it. She twisted in her grandmother's arms, reaching, making demanding noises. Thomas recognized his daughter's stubborn streak. She got it honest. "I hold her?" Akiko asked hesitantly. "Absolutely not," Helen snapped. Sarah shrieked in protest. Thomas sighed. "Helen, she's been here a week. All she's done is eat and sew. She ain't dangerous. She's the enemy. The war's over. Not for me, it isn't." Helen turned on her heel and marched back to the truck. But before she climbed in, she looked back at Akiko. "My daughter saved 3 Japanese children at Pearl Harbor," she said. "Died a year later from complications because she worked herself to death trying to save everyone." Enemy ally didn't matter to Margaret. She slammed the truck door. "If Tom thinks you're worth his time, I'll trust his judgment." "But you hurt him, or that baby there won't be enough of you left to bury." She drove off in a cloud of dust. Akiko stood very still. "That was your wife, Mother?" "Yeah. She is very angry." "Yeah. But she not hurt me?" Thomas thought about that. "No, she didn't." Helen's truck disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving silence in its wake. Thomas stood in the yard for a long time, watching the road, feeling the weight of his mother-in-law's words settle into his bones. My daughter died because of them. He'd heard it before, in town, at the general store, at church. The anger was everywhere, thick and choking as smoke. And he understood it. God knew he understood it. But Margaret hadn't died angry. She'd died trying to save one more life. And if Thomas let anger win, now let it make him cruel or cold or careless, then what had her death meant? He walked back to the barn. Akiko sat exactly where Helen had left her, still as stone-face pale. "She hate me," Akiko said quietly. "She hates what the war took from her." Thomas sat down on the porch step, suddenly exhausted. "You just happen to be wearing the uniform of the people who started it. I am sorry. So sorry. I know you are." They sat in silence as the sun moved across the sky. Eventually, Thomas stood and went inside to make dinner. When he came back out with 2 plates, Akiko was still there waiting. And that night, after they'd eaten, and she'd helped with the dishes, and gone back to the barn, Thomas found a letter on his porch. Not addressed, just a folded piece of paper, weighted down with a rock. He opened it and saw careful English, laboriously written. "Thomas-san, I write to say thank you. You give me food when I choose dying. You give me sewing tools that belong to wife you love. You let me see cows and laugh again. I do not understand why. In Japan they say American want revenge, want to hurt us for war. But you give only kindness. This confused me very much. Make me think everything I know is wrong. If you are enemy, you are strange kind of enemy. If you are friend, I do not deserve such friend. I am sorry for war, sorry for your wife Margaret, sorry for everything broken. I do not know how to fix, but I try to be worth the food you give, worth the kindness. This is all I can promise. Akiko. Thomas read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket right next to Margaret's photograph that Akiko had returned to him. Two women, two wars, two kinds of grief that somehow fit together in the space above his heart. He made fried chicken again for dinner the next evening, set 2 plates on the porch. When Akiko came up the steps, he handed her one and kept the other. "Sit," he said. She sat. They ate together as the sun went down, not talking, not needing to. Somewhere in the pasture, Rosie lowed. Cicadas started their evening song. The world kept turning indifferent to war and peace and the small kindnesses that built bridges over oceans of hurt. When they finished, Akiko helped him wash dishes. She stood at the sink, careful and methodical while he dried. They worked in the rhythm of people learning to exist in the same space without words. "Tomorrow," Thomas said, "I got to move the cattle to the north pasture. Could use a hand if you're willing." "I do not know cows. Neither did I once." "You'll learn." She nodded. "I learn." And that was how it started. Not with speeches or treaties or grand gestures, but with wet dishes and the promise of tomorrow and 2 people who'd lost everything deciding that maybe, just maybe, they could build something small from the wreckage. Outside, the Texas stars came out one by one, indifferent and eternal, watching over a ranch where an enemy learned to be human again, one meal at a time. The cherry blossom seeds arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, 28 years after the war ended. Thomas Garrett sat on his porch, the same porch where he'd watched a starving woman learn to eat again, and held the package in hands that shook more from age than emotion. 76 years old now, white-haired and thin, in the way of men who'd outlived their strength, but not their stubbornness. The Texas sun felt different these days. Gentler, maybe. Or maybe he was just too tired to fight it anymore. Sarah stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. 29 years old, a schoolteacher with her mother's eyes and her father's quiet determination. She'd driven out from town when he called, heard something in his voice that made her drop everything and come. The package was wrapped in brown paper tied with string that had traveled across an ocean. The postmark said, Nagoya, Japan. The return address was written in careful English above flowing Japanese characters. Akiko Hayashi Takahashi. He'd known this day would come, had waited for it if he was honest. Every year on October 15th, the anniversary of the day she'd finally eaten, he'd wondered. Every Christmas, every birthday, every quiet evening on this porch, he'd imagined what she might be doing. If she'd found her father, if she'd survived the aftermath of surrender in a country that didn't forgive defeat, if she'd remembered the cowboy who taught her to ride a horse. "Open it, Daddy," Sarah said softly. Thomas pulled the string. The paper fell away. Inside was a wooden box, simple and beautiful, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of care and time. He lifted the lid. The uniform lay folded on top, precisely creased, the fabric preserved with a care that bordered on reverence. Japanese military issue, the same dull green he remembered, but cleaned and mended until it looked almost new. He lifted it out, and there, sewn back into place with stitches so small they were nearly invisible, was the sleeve. The one she'd torn off and handed him the day she left. Beneath the uniform were photographs. Thomas picked up the first one with trembling fingers. 1950. Akiko stood in front of a university building, books clasped to her chest, wearing a simple dress and a smile that transformed her face. She looked alive in a way he'd never seen during those 8 weeks in Texas. Not just surviving, living. 1955. A wedding photo. Akiko in white standing beside a gentle-faced man in glasses. The husband smiled at the camera. Akiko smiled at her husband. 1960. 2 little girls, maybe 5 and 3, sitting on Akiko's lap. The oldest had her mother's serious eyes. The youngest laughed at something off-camera, gap-toothed and joyful. 1970. Akiko, older now, grey, threading through her dark hair, standing in front of a classroom. 20, maybe 30 children, all watching her demonstrate something with needle and thread. On the wall behind her, a photograph. Thomas had to squint to see it clearly. Then his breath caught. It was him. standing beside Rosie, his old mare hand on her neck. He didn't remember anyone taking that picture, but there it was, hanging in a classroom in Nagoya, Japan, 25 years and an ocean away. Sarah made a small sound beside him. "Oh, Daddy." There was more. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in red silk, the cowboy hat. His hat. The one he'd set on Akiko's head the day she learned to ride. It had been battered and sun-faded when he'd given it to her. Now it was carefully preserved, the brim straightened, the band cleaned. A museum piece, a relic of transformation. And beneath that, 2 items that broke him. Margaret's thimble, the one he'd given Akiko from his wife's sewing kit, polished until it shone, and beside it, folded into a square smaller than his palm, the baby blanket, the one he and Akiko had sewn together during those last 3 weeks. Stars and cherry blossoms, American and Japanese, woven into one fabric. The letter was last. 3 pages front and back, written in English that had grown confident over the decades. Thomas unfolded it. Sarah sat down beside him, her head against his shoulder, the way she used to when she was small. He read aloud, his voice rough with decades of cigarettes and dust and unshed tears. "Dear Thomas, 28 years. I have waited to send this, not because I forgot, never because I forgot, but because I needed to become someone worthy of the kindness you showed a starving enemy on a Texas ranch in 1945. I do not know if you are still alive. I do not know if this letter will reach you, but I am old enough now to understand that some debts must be paid regardless. Some gratitude must be spoken even if no one hears. You gave me back more than food. You gave me back my name, and in doing so, you gave me back my life. I was not a Kiko when I arrived at your ranch. I was prisoner. I was enemy. I was burden and shame and defeat. I was every failure of an empire that sent children to war and taught them honor meant death. I stood in your barn for 3 days waiting to die because I believed I deserved nothing else. The war was over. The emperor had surrendered. My purpose was gone. My family was gone. My country had lied to me about everything, including the nature of the enemy I should fear. If Americans were monsters, what did that make me for surrendering to them? If they were not monsters, what did that make the men who sent my brother to die fighting them? I could not answer these questions. So I chose to stop asking. I chose hunger. I chose silence. I chose the slow erasure I had been taught was the only honorable response to defeat. Then you brought me bacon. Thomas, I need you to understand what that bacon meant. It was not just food. It was not just survival. It was evidence, proof that everything I had been taught was wrong. The instructors told us Americans would starve prisoners, would poison our food, would use hunger as a weapon the way we had used it against others. But you brought me breakfast cooked with care, offered without condition, and when I refused, you simply tried again the next day. That persistence terrified me more than cruelty ever could. Cruelty I understood. Cruelty made sense. Cruelty would have confirmed everything I believed about enemies and war and the nature of surrender. But kindness from the people I had been taught to hate and fear, that kindness destroyed me. It destroyed every wall I had built, every belief I had clung to, every reason I had given myself to die. When I finally tasted that bacon, I tasted the truth. And the truth was this. I had been lied to, about you, about America, about the possibility of mercy in a merciless world. You did not save me by feeding me. You saved me by seeing me, by treating me not as enemy or prisoner or problem to be managed, but as a woman who was hungry and scared and lost. You gave me coffee and called it not food. You gave me your wife's sewing kit and called it just tools. You taught me to ride a horse and called it simple work. But I knew you were giving me more than objects or skills. You were giving me choices, the right to say yes or no, the right to move at my own pace, the right to exist without having to earn it through suffering or service or silence. Do you know how rare that is, to be given space to become yourself again, to be trusted with sharp scissors and hot coffee and a 1,000-pound animal when everyone else sees only threat? You trusted me when I did not trust myself. And that trust taught me I was worth trusting. I found my father. He survived the Nagoya firebombing, though he lost his sight and both hands to burns. When I returned to Japan in 1946, I found him living with my aunt in Osaka, barely alive, certainly not living. I told him about Texas, about you, about the cowboy who fed me fried chicken and taught me baseball and defended me against armed men who wanted revenge for sons lost in war. My father did not believe me at first. He said I had been brainwashed, that Americans were skilled at propaganda at making prisoners grateful for basic humanity, so they would betray their country upon return. So I showed him the letters. All 14 letters you mailed for me, one each month for over a year after I left your ranch. Letters I had written but could not send from the camp. Letters you kept and posted from your civilian address with your own money with no expectation of reply. My father held those letters in his ruined hands and wept. He said, "A man who mails letters for his enemy is not an enemy. He is something we have no word for in Japanese, something new. I went to university, studied textile arts, learned that sewing, the skill my mother taught me in childhood, and you returned to me in captivity, could be more than repair. It could be transformation." I met Hiroshi in 1953. He was a literature professor, gentle and kind, nothing like the soldiers who had marched through our streets promising glory and delivering ash. I told him about you on our second date. I needed him to know that an American cowboy had taught me what kindness looked like before any Japanese man had the chance. Hiroshi said that made him respect you, not resent you. He said any man who could teach a woman to trust again after war had broken her deserved honor, not jealousy. We married in 1954. We have 2 daughters. The eldest I named Margaret. I hope you do not mind. I hope you understand that your wife's name, her memory, her legacy of saving enemy children even as it cost her own life, deserve to be carried forward. Deserve to be spoken with love in a language she never knew by a woman she never met, who exists only because her husband remembered her teachings. My Margaret is 21 now. She is studying to be a nurse. When I told her why I gave her that name, she cried. She asked if she could write to you. I told her I did not know if you still lived, but if this letter reaches you, hers will follow. My youngest daughter is Sachiko. She is 19. She wants to be a teacher. She says watching me teach sewing to orphans showed her that the most important lessons are not in books. Yes, I teach orphans. Have taught them for 15 years now. 300 children, maybe more. I have lost count. Girls mostly, though, some boys. Children whose parents died in war or its aftermath. Children who, like me, lost everything and needed someone to show them that loss is not the end of story. I teach them to sew. Not because sewing is profitable, though it can be. Not because it is traditional, though it is. I teach them to sew because sewing taught me that broken things can be mended, that tears can be repaired, that something damaged is not something worthless. Every child I teach, I tell them about you, about the Texas cowboy who gave a starving enemy his wife's thimble and his own hat and the freedom to choose her own path. They do not always believe me. Some think I am telling fairy tales. Americans as heroes. Impossible, they say. Propaganda. So I show them the photographs. The one of you and Rosie. The one of me wearing your hat, grinning like a fool because I had just ridden a horse for the first time and felt for one perfect moment free. I show them the baby blanket we made together. I point to the American stars you taught me to stitch, the Japanese cherry blossoms I taught you. I show them how 2 enemies can create something beautiful when they choose thread over bullets. And then I tell them the truth that took me 30 years to fully understand. The enemy is never the person. The enemy is always the lie we tell about the person. You were never my enemy, Thomas. You were the man who proved my enemies had lied. I am sending you the uniform. I kept it all these years because it reminded me of who I was when I arrived at your ranch. Dead inside, hollow, a ghost in cloth. The sleeve you kept I have sewn back on. Not because the uniform needs to be whole, but because I do. That sleeve represents the piece of me I left in Texas. The piece that learned to trust and laugh and ride and live. Now the uniform is complete. And so am I. I am also sending seeds. Cherry blossom from a tree my mother planted the year I was born. That tree survived the firebombing, survived everything. It blooms every spring pink and defiant proof that beauty persists even after fire. Plant them somewhere you will see them, somewhere Margaret rests perhaps, so that something beautiful can grow from the soil of our war, so that her grave and mine when I join her in earth can be connected by trees that bloom in the same season under different skies. I am sending the hat. It fell apart years ago from where? I wore it every day for 15 years, Thomas. Every single day. My husband asked me once why I insisted on wearing a battered American cowboy hat in the streets of Nagoya. I told him it reminded me that I had been a cowboy once, that I had ridden free across Texas dirt, that freedom once tasted never fully leaves you. I had it restored by a craftsman in Kyoto. He asked what made this hat so precious. I told him an enemy gave it to me. He did not understand. I did not expect him to. I am sending the thimble and the blanket. These belong with you and Sarah. Tell her that her blanket kept me warm through the coldest nights. Not warm in body, warm in heart, warm in the knowledge that I had helped create something, had contributed. Something had mattered to someone even when I believed I mattered to no one. Tell her that her mother's thimble taught me that grief is not the end of love. That love, like thread, can be passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, country to country, and never diminish. Tell her that I think of her every October 15th, the day I ate bacon and chose life, the day her father gave me permission to be hungry without shame. I do not know what happens after we die, Thomas. I do not know if Margaret waits for you somewhere, if my mother and brother wait for me. I do not know if souls persist, or if we are simply stories told by those who survive us. But I know this. If there is anything beyond this life, I will find Margaret there, and I will thank her. I will thank her for teaching you that the enemy is just a frightened person in different cloth. I will thank her for dying in service of that truth, for saving children who belong to the country that would kill her. I will thank her for creating a man who could stand on a porch with bacon and coffee and simple human decency and change the course of a stranger's life. You asked me once why I refused food for 3 days. I told you I did not know. That was a lie. I knew. I refused because I was not refusing food. I was refusing salvation. I was refusing the possibility that I deserved to be saved. I was refusing a world where enemies could be kind, where defeat could lead to dignity, where a woman who had lost everything could be given a horse and a hat and a chance to start again. I refused because accepting meant admitting I had been wrong. About you, about America, about the worth of my own life. You did not let me refuse forever. You were patient, persistent. You brought food I could not eat and coffee I could not resist, and eventually, inevitably, I broke. Thank you for breaking me. Thank you for feeding me. Thank you for teaching me to ride. Thank you for mailing my letters when you had every reason to burn them. Thank you for defending me when you had every reason to let them take me. Thank you for seeing a woman when everyone else saw an enemy. Thank you for finishing what Margaret started, for choosing mercy when revenge would have been easier, for planting kindness in soil soaked with blood. I am 72 years old now. I have lived a good life, a full life. I have loved and been loved. I have taught and been taught. I have watched cherry blossoms bloom for 72 springs, and every single year I think of you. Every spring I remember the cowboy who gave me seeds when he could have given me nothing, who gave me choices when he could have given me orders, who gave me back my name when the world had taken everything else. If you are reading this, you are alive. If you are alive, know this. The woman you fed in 1945 has fed 300 children in your honor. The woman you taught to ride has taught 100 girls that freedom is a muscle that must be exercised. The woman you called by her name when she had forgotten it herself now makes certain every child she meets knows they are worthy of being named, being seen, being fed. You created ripples, Thomas Garrett. Ripples that crossed an ocean. Ripples that touched lives you will never meet. Ripples that will continue long after we are both dust. That is what mercy does. It multiplies. Plant the seeds, watch them grow, and know that in Japan, under similar trees, an old woman tells children about the enemy who became her teacher. With gratitude beyond language, Akiko Hayashi Takahashi Postscript. Please tell Sarah her blanket has been washed and mended and loved for 28 years. Tell her that her mother's hands, though gone, still create warmth through mine. Tell her that she should be proud, not just of her father, but of the legacy her mother left, a legacy of seeing humanity in enemies, of saving those the world would rather forget. Tell her a Japanese grandmother says thank you for being born, for existing, for being the reason her father had to keep living, keep trying, keep choosing kindness when grief made cruelty easier. Tell her she matters. Tell her she always did. Thomas set the letter down. His hands were shaking badly now. Sarah was crying openly, tears streaming down her face, one hand pressed to her mouth. She fed 300 children, Sarah whispered. Because you fed her. Thomas couldn't speak. He looked at the photographs, at the uniform with its carefully mended sleeve, at the hat he'd given a frightened woman who didn't know how to be anything but afraid, at seeds from a tree that had survived firebombing. He stood slowly, knees protesting, and walked to the shed, found his shovel, walked to the small fenced plot where Margaret rested under a simple stone. Sarah followed, carrying the silk-wrapped seeds. The ground was hard, Texas dirt baked solid by decades of sun. Thomas dug anyway, each shovelful an act of faith, of completion, of closing a circle that had been open for 28 years. He planted the seeds in a line beside Margaret's grave. 5 seeds, 5 chances for beauty to take root in hard ground. Sarah knelt and helped him cover them, her hands gentle in the dirt. When they finished, she sat back and looked at the disturbed earth. Will they grow here, Daddy? Wrong climate, wrong soil. Thomas shrugged. Don't know, but they survived firebombs. Figure they can survive Texas. They sat in silence for a long time. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. Finally, Sarah spoke. Are you going to write back? Thomas considered. His hands were arthritic, his eyesight failing. His words had never been good even when he was young. But some debts had to be paid. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I am. What will you say? He thought about bacon and coffee and a woman who chose starvation because she didn't believe she deserved breakfast. He thought about Margaret saving enemy children and dying for it. He thought about a baby blanket sewn by 2 people who had every reason to hate each other and chose thread instead. He thought about 300 children learning to sew in Nagoya, learning that broken things can be mended, learning that the enemy is always the lie. I'll tell her the truth, Thomas said. I'll tell her she didn't need to be worthy. She already was. I just gave her thread. She did all the mending herself. Sarah leaned against him. They sat that way until the sun touched the horizon, turning the Texas sky to gold and crimson and finally deep purple. The first stars appeared. The air cooled. The day released its heat back to the earth. 3 days later, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with paper and pen. His handwriting was shaky, his words simple, but he wrote, Dear Akiko, the seeds are planted. Come spring, we'll see if Texas dirt can grow Japanese cherry blossoms. My money's on the trees. They learned from you. Stubborn runs deep. Margaret would have loved you. Sarah does. I do. You didn't need to become worthy. You always were. I just gave you bacon and coffee. You did everything else. 300 children is a lot of bacon to pay forward. You've fed more souls than I ever could. Margaret would be proud. I am too. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for writing. Thank you for living long enough to teach all those kids that broken things mend. Your friend across the ocean. Thomas Garrett postscript. Sarah says, tell you the blanket is in a frame on her classroom wall. She's a teacher too. Says every time a student asks about it, she tells them about the Japanese woman and the Texas cowboy who proved that enemies is just a word. Human is the truth. He mailed it the next day. The cherry trees bloomed that following spring. Against all odds, against wrong climate and wrong soil, and every reason they shouldn't, they bloomed. 5 trees, pink and defiant, proof that beauty persists. Thomas died 2 years later at 78 under those trees, Sarah holding one hand, her daughters holding the other. His last words were not about pain or regret or fear. His last words were, "Tell Akiko the trees bloomed." They did. Every spring. Pink and impossible. And in Nagoya, an old woman wearing a carefully preserved cowboy hat stood in front of a classroom and told children about the enemy who proved that mercy multiplies, about bacon that saved a life, about a letter that crossed an ocean, about cherry trees that bloomed in Texas soil because a cowboy believed broken things could mend. The war had ended 40 years ago, but the peace they built, one meal, one letter, one act of impossible kindness at a time, was still growing, still blooming, still multiplying.